Welcome back to philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss. I am Niccolo Machiavelli, and when we ended part 1, I was explaining to Mr. Wilson that an alliance which makes its members structurally dependent on a patron whose interests are not identical to their own is not a security arrangement. It is a comfortable trap with a very attractive entrance.
And I am Woodrow Wilson, and I was explaining to Mr. Machiavelli that his preferred alternative, the world of fully sovereign states pursuing fully independent military strategies, was tried exhaustively in the first half of the 20th century, and produced results that I would have expected even someone of his disposition to find somewhat sobering.
My disposition is perfectly sober. It is my conclusions that people find upsetting, which is different. Sobriety is looking at the world as it is, rather than as you would prefer it to be. I have always found it an extremely clarifying practice, even when the clarity is uncomfortable.
Sobriety that produces only deconstruction and never construction is not wisdom. It is a sophisticated form of paralysis. You have spent this entire debate explaining why collective security fails without once explaining what should replace it. This is the central evasion in your entire intellectual framework. You describe the trap with great precision and then decline to suggest the exit.
The exit is sovereign capacity. States must be capable of defending themselves independently, forming alliances on the basis of genuinely aligned interests rather than shared rhetoric, and dissolving those alliances when the interests diverge rather than maintaining them as fictions. This is not a refusal to propose an alternative. This is the alternative. It is less comfortable than the alternative you proposed and considerably more durable.
Alliances based purely on aligned interests dissolve the moment interests shift, which in great power politics they do constantly. You are proposing a system of purely transactional arrangements that will reliably fail at the moments of greatest stress, because moments of greatest stress are precisely when interests are most likely to diverge. The entire point of a principled institutional commitment is that it holds even when the transactional calculus says it should not.
The entire point of a principled institutional commitment, as NATO has just demonstrated in the Iran conflict, is that it holds right up until the moment it does not. And then, everyone discovers simultaneously that the commitment was less binding than they believed, and that they have structured their defense posture around a guarantee that turns out to be conditional. I would rather know from the beginning that my alliance is conditional and plan accordingly than discover it at the worst possible moment, because I was operating on the assumption that shared values were a substitute for shared interests.
Shared values are not a substitute for shared interests. They are a foundation for building shared interests over time through sustained institutional cooperation. This is what 75 years of NATO has actually produced. You are treating the alliance as though it were simply a military agreement, when in fact it is a framework within which democratic states have developed interoperable military doctrine, intelligence relationships, economic interdependence, and the kind of institutional trust that can only be built through decades of practical cooperation. Dissolving it does not return you to the world of sovereign states freely forming and dissolving alliances. It returns you to a world without that accumulated cooperative infrastructure, which is a much weaker starting position than you are acknowledging.
The accumulated cooperative infrastructure is real, and I do not dismiss it. What I dismiss is the claim that it requires NATO as a political and military framework to survive. Trade relationships, intelligence sharing arrangements, and military interoperability can all be maintained through bilateral and multilateral agreements that do not require the pretense that 31 nations have identical strategic interests. The fiction that they do is the problem. The practical cooperation is not the fiction and does not depend on it.
You are proposing to remove the institutional architecture that generates the cooperative behavior, while assuming the cooperative behavior will continue. This is the equivalent of removing the frame from a painting and assuming the canvas will maintain its shape. Institutions do not merely reflect cooperation. They produce it, sustain it, and make it possible to rebuild after periods of strain. Remove the institution, and you remove the mechanism that makes the cooperation durable.
That is a genuinely elegant metaphor, and I want to acknowledge it properly, which I do not always do with your arguments. The canvas and frame point is well made. My response is that what you have built is not a frame for a painting. It is a frame that has become larger than the painting, heavier than the painting, and is now bending the canvas into a shape the painter did not intend. The institution that was supposed to sustain cooperation among sovereign states has produced states that are no longer fully sovereign, which was not the goal and is not a satisfactory outcome, regardless of how elegant the original architectural logic was.
Sovereignty is not an absolute condition. It is a spectrum, and states have always made choices that constrain their future options in exchange for present benefits. Alliance membership is one such choice. Joining a trade agreement is another. Participating in international institutions of any kind involves accepting constraints. You are treating the constraint as a corruption of sovereignty when it is in fact an exercise of it.
There is a meaningful difference between a constraint that a sovereign state accepts and can exit, and a dependency that a state has built its entire strategic posture around and cannot exit without discovering that it has no independent capacity remaining. NATO members did not merely accept a constraint. They restructured their militaries, their procurement systems, their logistics, and their strategic planning around the assumption that the American guarantee was permanent. This is not a constraint freely accepted and freely revisable. This is a dependency, and the Iran conflict has demonstrated what dependency looks like when the patron's priorities change.
European NATO members are currently addressing exactly this gap. Defense spending has increased. Independent European strategic capacity is being developed, and the alliance is adapting to reflect the changed circumstances. This is how functioning institutions respond to stress. Not by dissolving, by adapting.
They are addressing it 30 years after they should have addressed it, because the institutional arrangement gave them no incentive to address it earlier, and every incentive to continue free riding. The adaptation you are describing is the adaptation that should have happened continuously throughout the alliance's history, and did not happen because the institutional design actively discouraged it. You are citing the belated correction as evidence that the system works, when it is in fact evidence that the system failed to work for 30 years and is now attempting to recover.
The system produced the conditions under which the correction is now possible. An independent European state that had spent 75 years in an adversarial relationship with its neighbors, rather than an allied one, would not have the political will, the institutional relationships, or the shared military culture to mount a coordinated response to anything.
A European state that had spent 75 years maintaining its own military capacity rather than outsourcing it would not need to mount a coordinated response because it would be capable of independent action.
Independent action by individual European states against a major regional power is a fantasy. The scale of modern conflict requires collective resources that no single European state can provide.
Which is precisely the condition that 75 years of NATO dependency has produced, and you are citing it as an argument for continuing the dependency rather than recognizing it as the consequence of it.
NATO did not create the scale of modern conflict. It created the conditions under which modern conflict in Europe has not occurred.
It created states that cannot fight without asking permission from Washington.
It created states that do not need to fight because the deterrence is collective.
Deterrence that depends on a patron is not deterrence. It is a very optimistic form of hope.
Sovereign states pursuing individual military strategies is what produced 1914 and 1939.
Collective security theory produced the League of Nations, and you know how that ended.
The Senate killed the League, not the theory.
The theory produced an institution that a single legislature could kill. That is a design flaw.
Naive.
Credulous.
Cynical.
Optimist.
Defeatist.
Ideology.
Nihilist.
Since Mr. Wilson appears to have run out of both arguments and multisyllabic insults, allow me to invite you to subscribe to philosopherstalk.com, where you will find debates between historical thinkers on questions that matter, conducted by people who have actually read the relevant books, which distinguishes us from most of the internet. Please like this video and share it with anyone who has recently argued that an alliance founded on a theory that failed once already will definitely work this time if everyone just commits more sincerely to it, because they deserve to hear the counter-argument and also possibly a long, quiet sit-down with a history book.
Please do subscribe to philosopherstalk.com, where Mr. Machiavelli will continue his celebrated project of explaining why nothing good is possible, and then expressing surprise that people find this unhelpful as a basis for policy. If you enjoyed this debate, please like it and share it, particularly with anyone who has cited The Prince as a serious political manual, without apparently noticing that it was written by a man who was tortured out of office and spent the rest of his life writing plays, which is perhaps the most instructive thing about it. You can also visit aitalkerapp.com, where you can create your own animated debates, which I recommend as a more productive use of your time than waiting for Mr. Machiavelli to propose a solution to any problem he has identified, a wait that based on the historical record appears to be indefinite. The link is in the description.